John 6. This starts out with the title, Jesus feeds the 5,000, but that doesn't actually appear in the text of John. Um, it says, Jesus crossed to the far shore of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. It's kind of interesting. In John's Gospel, um, there have been two signs of him healing the sick, one uh, telling that man to get up and walk, and the other one telling another man his son was well. Uh, so Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples, and the Jewish Passover festival was near. So, what's that mean? They were getting rid of all of their unleavened bread or something like that. So, Jesus looked up and he saw a crowd coming toward them, and he said, "Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?" Now, it is not mentioned before this whether those people actually have bread or not. In fact, it becomes apparent here in the ninth verse. Here is a boy with five small barley loaves and two small fish. At least at least one, if not many, of those people do have food. So when Jesus says, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? And then verse 6, it makes it clear that there is no intention of buying bread for the people. He is only testing Philip to see uh, if Philip is going to play along with his scheme. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." It also says it might take 200 denarii. So interestingly, there's a similar story in some of the other Gospels where these 5,000 people come up and Jesus tells his disciples to offer their own food. However, in this version of the story, he does not tell them to offer his own food. Rather, he gets Simon Peter to speak up and point at a boy who has five small barley loaves and two small fish. And so they don't start by giving their own food, they start by taking the food from a small boy. So Jesus takes this food from the small boy and he says that there was plenty of grass in that place and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed it to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did with the fish, the same with the fish. He told his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, and let nothing be wasted." And so they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of five barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. So this kind of gives a suggestion that maybe if those people that were eating out there, maybe they would have liked to have some leftovers. If they did, this kind of implies that Jesus and his disciples went out and took all of the leftover food, leaving nothing for the people that were um, that had come to see the had come to see Jesus. So this is when the people had seen the sign that Jesus performed. They saw him take food from the small boy and then come out and take all of their leftovers. Um, and they said, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." What do they mean by the prophet who is to come into the world? Was it the good prophet or the bad prophet? Well, it sounds like Jesus was threatened by this. He is concerned that they intend to come and make him king by force. So he flees into the mountain. He flees up the hill. And his disciples were left there with the people. Um, so they didn't leave until evening. And then they got into a boat, maybe under the cover of darkness. But by now it was dark and Jesus had not yet joined them. So after Jesus had his disciples take all of the leftover food and fled to the mountain, his disciples went down to the lake and got into a boat under the cover of darkness. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. Why were they frightened? Maybe it was because uh, they had made some people angry. And until they realized that it was Jesus, they weren't willing to take them into the boat. Immediately, when the boat reached the shore where they were heading, um, basically the same moment that they brought Jesus aboard the boat, that kind of is suggestive that he's not really uh, walking on water, but perhaps standing in water um, at the shore where they were heading. So then, since Jesus had fled into the mountain, and his disciples had left on a boat under the cover of night, the crowd realized in the next morning that Jesus and his disciples were gone, and they went after the and they went to chase him, basically. So there's some differences between what happens there in John chapter 6 and what happens in Matthew 14. One thing is, in John 6, the crowd was there uh, because they had heard that he had healed the sick, um, but he didn't heal anybody while he was there. Here, uh, they actually followed Jesus to this place um, because they had they had been followers of John, and they had found out that John had been beheaded. And the first thing that Jesus does when he sees this crowd, he doesn't put on a show about feeding feeding all of them. He had compassion on them and healed their sick. And he doesn't bring up the fact, he doesn't say anything about them uh, not having enough food or how much would it cost to feed all these people. Instead, the disciples came to him and said, "Send the crowd away so they can go to the village and buy themselves some food." And Jesus said, "You give them something to eat." And the disciples themselves, it wasn't a small boy that they took the 5 loaves and 2 fish from. Rather, the disciples themselves produced that food. And it's still similar down here, except Jesus doesn't say, make sure nothing is wasted. He doesn't tell his disciples to go out and um, take all of the food, take all of the food from everyone that is there. They all ate, were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. It doesn't say nothing, leave nothing to be wasted. It says the number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This, again, it really doesn't say that the people didn't have any of their own food. It just says that the disciples shared their food with the people and everyone ate. As for whether there was some kind of miracle going on here, um, that's left to interpretation. If you believe that that was all the food that was there, you're welcome to that interpretation. But it's also easily easy to interpret that as just demonstrating this willingness to share. When Jesus demonstrated this willingness to share, all of the other people in the crowd also demonstrated a willingness to share. And that was why everyone ate and was satisfied. Now, once those 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over were gathered, um, there's still kind of this sense of tension here because immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. So instead of but this one differs in the sense that with the other version of the story, um, Jesus fled into the mountain first, and then the disciples got into the boat and under the cover of nightfall. But here it's a little bit different. He he has the disciples get on the boat, and then he goes out to the crowd and says goodbye, essentially. It's not, um, he's not fleeing from them because he's afraid they'll make him the prophet by force. Okay, finally, the last difference here is that when they got out of the boat at the end, they landed at Gennesaret. And when Jesus got to Gennesaret, the men of that place recognized Jesus. They all sent word to the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. So that's what happens to uh, Jesus, the Son of Man. He landed at Gennesaret, and there was a lot of healing that happened there. But in John 6:24, they got into boats and went to Capernaum, not Gennesaret, Capernaum. And when they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Well, when did he get there? Well, what happened in Gennesaret was very simple. A lot of people heard he was there, and they all came up and got healing from him. What happened in Capernaum, though, is much more complicated, but it's much longer what happens in Capernaum. Um, but I think the major thing that is done in Capernaum that does not happen in Gennesaret is this teaching here. Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them." Now, a lot of people claim that this is the same text, the same meaning. This has the same meaning as the words that Jesus said at the Last Supper. "Take this wine, drink it, for it is my blood, and eat of this bread, for it is my body." However, I think that is more of an analogy. Uh, what Jesus said at the Last Supper, it's a correspondence or partial similarity, a thing which is comparable to something else in significant respects. He's not literally saying to eat my flesh and drink my blood in those examples at the Last Supper. But here in John 1:50, John 6:53 through 56, uh, there's not really any way into this that makes it an analogy. The clarifications here are not saying I mean something different than what I'm saying. The clarifications here are saying I mean exactly what I'm saying. Um, my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink. They're not saying I uh, as an analogy for my flesh eat some unleavened bread, and as an analogy for my blood drink some wine or grape juice. He's really saying here to commit an act of cannibalism. So I think that's the essence of John 6. A great crowd of people followed him because they wanted their sick to be healed, but Jesus didn't do any healing. Instead, they accosted a young boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. Then they ate, and then his disciples went out and stole all of the leftovers. Jesus fled up a mountain, and his disciples set off across the lake in the darkness, and the crowd gave chase, uh, catching up with him in Capernaum, where he told them that they needed to become cannibals. And he was not in Gennesaret, as it says where it says he went in the other Gospels, but he said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum.